Part 35. I heard a low growl and looked up, my body instinctively tensing. That very low growl, which can only be heard by another wolf at that volume, screamed, "I'm about at my limit." Jonathan felt my body tense, though, and he followed my gaze. "I think we better help those guys out," he stated. Joel nodded, and we all walked over. My eyes quickly scanned the group. To my surprise, it was Marcus that had sent out the nearly silent warning. His eyes were down a bit, and his body was tense. The vampires didn't recognize it, but it was loud as thunder to me. What had I missed? I glanced at the others, and Missy gave me a look that told me whatever it wasn't good. Alyssa smiled at me. "The guys were just telling us some things about wolves that we didn't know." Like we didn't have to shift with the full moon, I thought, but just nodded. Margaret looked embarrassed and had her head down, and Nicole was looking at the fire. Alyssa, however, was grinning. "I didn't realize that wolves had to take all their clothes off before they shifted." She glanced at Marcus, her eyes lingering a little too long. "It does make sense, though. I mean, really, where would all the clothes go, after all?" Phil was tense now, too, which made us pack mates very jumpy. I looked at Alyssa. "Don't you think that's a bit inappropriate to ask?" She balked, and I stepped forward, instinctively trying to put myself between her and Marcus, since he was the one that gave out the warning. "Asking them about what they do with their clothes?" I chuckled. "Wouldn't that be asking you like what you did with yours when you took a shower?" Alyssa's eyes narrowed, but I didn't care. My pack instinct was taking over. I walked a few steps in front of her, keeping my eyes on her. "Or asking you how you feed?" I turned and paced back the other way. "I wasn't trying to be rude," she hissed at me. "I was just trying to learn more about your friends." She straightened her back, and I smiled, a slow smile. Missy was standing closer to me now, and Phil cleared his throat. I stared at her and opened my mouth, but Phil gave a small shake of his head. I growled softly, but kept my eyes on hers. Alyssa lifted her chin and looked down at me, but I saw a hint of worry in those blue eyes. That made me smile a little bit more. I went to move closer to her, and she flinched, just a little. That excited me. She was trying to square off, but was losing. I stepped back, just a little, and then stopped and faced her. Our eyes were locked, and everyone had gone quiet. My pack knew this was how the pecking order was established and maintained. I'm sure Jonathan knew that as well. Alyssa narrowed her gaze. "Why are you doing that?" she whispered in a hard but quiet voice. I shrugged, without breaking eye contact. "Doing what?" She rolled her eyes and turned to Marcus. "It's her condition. She gets a little excited at times." Phil had me around the waist and turned me, all in one motion. He walked me off a few paces and then smiled at me. "Good job. But next time, don't make it so obvious." I looked at him and he nodded. "She's not a wolf, Reina. You have to remember that." He wasn't yelling at me? "She's squaring off. No doubt about it. The rules are basically the same, no matter what race they are. But there are some differences." "What do I do then?" I asked. "That pup is what you need to figure out." "I'm not a pup," I growled, but without much anger. "You'll always be a pup to us." We both turned, and I rolled my eyes as Trax stepped up. He smiled at me. "Are you being a naughty wolf already?" Phil laughed. "Actually, she's learning the finer points of topping. Unfortunately, she's thinking only with her wolf instincts." "Is this some kind of riddle?" I asked. Track nodded. "Yes." I sighed. Obviously, they weren't going to tell me anything more. I shivered a bit to try to get my hackles back down and then moaned. Not now, I whispered internally and looked down at my legs that were tingling. I closed my eyes and concentrated. Crap, I heard Track hiss, but I ignored it. I had control. I could do this. My hands were in fists now, and I felt my wolf try to push her way out. Seems the squaring off gave her a little more power than normal. I found the focus and forced it back. I slowed my breathing and ignored the voices around me. There was no way I was going to shift in front of Alyssa and her friends. It had been close enough the last time. I drew in a long, slow breath and then opened my eyes. I nodded to Phil and Track, and they smiled. Jonathan was standing there now, too, and I winked at him. All clear, I stated, and he nodded. I hadn't shifted since the incident outside the pool room. I felt the tingle try to return, like an ache this time. I shut it down and nodded. Phil glanced at me. You might want to shift before the party. It'll help. Okay, I whispered, and then turned my head. Jackson and Rock were with the others now, and Nicole and Margaret were back to smiling and giggling. Alyssa was talking to Marcus, and she didn't look as agitated this time. And he didn't look as agitated this time. Maybe she was finally apologizing, sincerely. After that, we all had a great time. We laughed, joked, and talked about a lot of things. Alyssa did try to throw things at me, especially when she talked about clubs or places I hadn't been. I had done a lot of traveling with my dad, but it had been, well, with my dad. She talked about trips her and her friends went on and how much fun they had, but she didn't get the reaction she hoped for. The subject would branch out to other things, and she would finally have to join in. The cook brought out more food, and Rock and Jonathan hugged her. She swatted at them playfully, but she was smiling when she left. A while later, I caught Missy trying to hide a yawn. I was sitting next to Jonathan, and I looked over at his watch. It was just after 1 a.m., past Wolf bedtime. I sighed, not wanting this to end, but when she yawned again, I stood up. Well, guys, I think it's getting close to my bedtime. Missy smiled at me. She didn't want to be the one to end the party. I would take that for her. Alyssa and her friends moaned and pouted a little. I shrugged. This was a blast. But that wolf side of me still needs her sleep, I chuckled. Not wanting to look like Alyssa and insult any part of a wolf, Margaret and Nicole stood up and actually started to help pick up the chairs. Missy and Miles came over to me and she hugged me tightly. I had so much fun. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad you came, and yes, it was fun. Once the guys broke us out, I winked, and she nodded, grinning. Miles gave me a hug as well, and then Marcus and Phil did the same. Be good, and remember what I said, Phil whispered in my ear. I don't want you getting in trouble, but I was proud of you tonight. I looked at him, and he nodded. An alpha likes knowing that he can count on his pack. I don't doubt it of any of you. I smiled wide then, and he turned to say good night to Jonathan. Rock yanked me off my feet and twirled me around. Then he stood me back on the ground. He kissed me and then whispered, So, am I allowed to call one of them? I frowned. Do you want to? He shrugged. Well, Nicole is kind of cute. I smiled and nodded. He winked and then grunted when Jackson shoved him out of the way. He hugged me tightly and then turned and talked to Jonathan. Track stayed behind, but the others left. The rest of us watched Joel put out the fire, then we went inside. Allison and Joel said good night then, and Allison told me she would call me in the morning. She would call me tomorrow. Paige hugged me, and Jonathan stole a glance at Michael, and then left to her room, probably to escape. Alyssa smiled at Track. Are you staying here tonight? I have some business with Ray's dad, and then he looked at Jonathan, who nodded, and he continued. then have some other stuff to do before I head out." I looked at them both and they grinned at me. Nicole smiled and then her phone went off. She pulled it out and bounced a little. "It's rock," she whispered, and I shook my head as she turned around and started to push buttons. Margaret stepped up. "I had a great time. Thank you both." Jonathan nodded. "We're very glad that you came and glad that you can stay until the party." She grinned, then gave me a hug. I turned to Alyssa. "Thanks again. This was actually a lot of fun, and the prizes were amazing." I made sure not to sound sarcastic, and her smile showed she noticed. "You're welcome. I was glad to be allowed to do it." There was a brief moment of silence, and then I nodded. "Well, I better get to bed. I'll see you all tomorrow." Jonathan took my hand, and we walked down the hallway. "By the way, you owe me." He smiled, and I looked at him. He nodded. "For saving you from that party." "Really?" I stated, grinning. The alarm on his watch beeped, and we both stopped. Jonathan took the thermos that Michael handed him. He looked at the readout and handed it to me. "Yes, really, if it wasn't for me placing that bonfire right where I knew you'd see it," he shrugged as I drank. "You might still be there doing whatever she had you doing." I handed him back the thermos. "Okay, so what do you want?" Track and the guys demanded pies. "Really?" I nodded and he shrugged. "I don't want pie." I looked at him and waited. He smiled, handed Michael the empty thermos, and then leaned into my ear. "I want to sleep with you in my arms tonight." I balked and he nodded. "I'll be good, I promise, and no one will know, so your reputation will stay safe." "Aunt Mary?" I whispered back, although Michael and Martin had turned away. He winked. "I'll take care of that." I smiled again, and he leaned down to kiss me. "There you are!" came a light but loud voice. We both turned to see Aunt Mary walking towards us, her arms already out. "Did she hear you?" I whispered, and he chuckled. We both turned to her, and she grabbed us, smashing us both in her arms. "I thought I was going to need to rescue you," she whispered. I smiled. "The guys already did, but thank you." "So I heard. A bonfire," she chuckled at Jonathan. "See there? Smarts run in the family." She looked at me. "You must find time for me tomorrow, dear. We have to meet with my hairdresser. Things will never go well if you wait until the last minute on your hair." "Okay," I smiled. And then she turned to Jonathan. "Now as for you, we have some things to talk about too." She tapped her chin. Yes, we do. You go say your good nights and get her settled, and then meet me in my room." Jonathan frowned. "Can it wait until tomorrow, Aunt Mary? I also have to see Mr. Beldren and Track after I get her settled." I bit my lip, but she shook her head. "No, it can't. Now you take care of Reina here, then you go see to her dad and Track. After that, we'll have our talk." She winked, and he nodded without smiling. She turned and hurried down the hallway, always walking as if she had somewhere very important to go. He looked down at me. "Don't worry, I'll find a way." I giggled, took his arm, and we headed to my room. He waited on the bed while I went into the bathroom and changed into my pajamas. I came out with another brush and sat brushing my hair while we talked. I liked these times, just the two of us, after the night was over. We could talk about anything, and there was never any awkward silence now. I yawned, and he took the brush out of my hand and set it on my nightstand. He handed me Wolfie when I laid down, and then he kissed me. Finally he sat up a little, still looking at me. "I do love you, Reina," he whispered. "Now I really know what I want to do for the rest of my life." My brows lifted, and he nodded. "I want to spend each night with you in my arms." I smiled and almost came back with a silly comment, but I swallowed it, not wanting to ruin the moment. "What do you have to talk to my dad and Track about?" I finally said, after another soft kiss. "Party stuff, security stuff," he shrugged, and I nodded. "And your Aunt Mary?" "That one, I have no idea. Maybe she knows what you were planning and is going to strap you into a cot when you get there. Then I'll wait till she's out of the room, break free, and come claim my due." "Your due?" I laughed, and he shrugged. "I was going for romantic comedy. Cut me some slack." When he finally stood, I felt sad. I didn't want him to go. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he stated, leaning over and kissing me one more time. I watched him walk out the door. As always, it hurt just a little. Then I rolled over, pulled Wolfie up under my chin, and closed my eyes. If I made myself sleep, even though it was early, then the time would pass faster and Jonathan would be here, holding me. I could hardly wait. Unfortunately, it seemed I was going to have to wait. I woke up, rested, and looked around the room. Even his chair was empty. I frowned and pulled out my clock. "It's 4 p.m., I growled, looking around again, and wrinkled my nose. He didn't come. I felt the tingle and shook my head. "He said he would come," I whispered. Then I felt the tingle again, but not in my nose. It was in my legs. I sighed and looked down at them. "Well, Phil said I better do this before the party, and since I was all alone," I glared at the empty chair. I had never shifted when I was alone before, and a sudden pang of fear hit me. The tingling got stronger. I had to either stop it now or relax and let it happen. "I can do this," I told myself again. "I have to prove to them and myself I can do this even alone." I closed my eyes and curled up on my side. That seemed to be the best position. A tear ran down my face as I started my mantra and pulled myself out of the pain. I did cry out as it started, and then it was gone, and I was in that space in my mind that I sat and repeated my phrases as the change took place. It only took about a full minute now, but I did a lot in my mind in that time. The repeated phrases helped. "Don't hurt them. Keep talking." I said those even though there was no one with me. It was a habit I didn't want to break, unsure of what might happen if I did. I opened my eyes and lifted my head, then yelped as Track was sitting on the side of my bed, smiling at me. "Trying to shift alone?" I snorted and jumped off the bed. I gave myself a hard shake and then bent down and stretched. This felt good. I had missed these muscles. I looked up at him and he raised his brows. "That wasn't very smart, Ray." I walked closer to him and he rolled his eyes. "Don't give me that look. I know you want to prove you're capable, but shifting alone?" Nothing happened, I thought, and he nodded, luckily. "Oh, stop being a nursemaid," I tried, letting my thoughts sound light and playful. When he still didn't smile, I nudged his hand with my nose. Then he cracked and chuckled. Good. I was forgiven. I turned and looked back at the empty chair. "Is everything okay with Jonathan?" "Yes and no," Track grinned. "He's fine, but his aunt has had him in her room all night. And I mean all night." I turned and he nodded. "He was meeting with your dad and I. We had only been talking a little over an hour and she came in." He shook his head. "If I weren't a werewolf, I think she would crack a few ribs with those hugs." Track rubbed his side for emphasis. Then she told him it was time for their talk, and that was the last we saw of him. I went to bed at around 2 a.m., I thought, sitting up. "If he was only with you for an hour, let's say 3:30 just to be safe, it's 4 p.m. now." I barked. "That's over 12 hours. I turned and trotted to the door. He came up with me. "You sure you want to go out there? Alyssa and her friends are still here." I didn't care. There was nothing I could think of that would have them talking so long. A worry started to bubble in my stomach, and I scratched at the door. Stay with me then, he stated. He reached for the door and then looked at me. Okay, I huffed, eager to find out what the problem was. He nodded and turned the handle. As soon as there was enough room, I pushed my nose through and then my body. Michael and Martin looked down at me and I shook myself again, my necklace swaying as I did. Trek followed me out and then asked my guards if they had seen Jonathan. Michael said the same thing. Last he knew, Jonathan was with his aunt in her room. Take me to her room, I snorted, and Track asked Michael where that was. My bodyguard led the way, and we were just down the hall from it when Alyssa and her friends came around another corner. I stopped and gave a low growl. Track stopped with one leg in front of me. The girls all squealed in delight and rushed over. "Oh my God!" Margaret shrilled. "Is that a werewolf?" "Why do they think we're deaf?" I asked, and I looked up to see Track grinning. He nodded to Margaret, and she stared at me with a huge smile on her face. Alyssa tilted her head. "I've seen that one before," she stated, and then nodded. She looked up at Track. "Do we already know this one?" I growled again, and Track pushed his leg back against me a little. "She's a friend of mine," he stated. "A female," Alyssa nodded. "Oh, this must be Missy." She smiled down at me and then knelt. "Hello, Missy." Track shook his head. "It's not Missy." Nicole shrugged. "I thought females were rare. If this isn't Missy..." Then her face broke out in a huge smile. "Oh, I see. This is your mate." Margaret nodded. "That explains a lot of things." The two chuckled and Alyssa frowned a little. "Why didn't you invite her to the party, Track?" She stood and gave him a hard look. "We would have loved to have her there." He went to say something, but then Margaret noticed my necklace. "Dang thing. Doesn't Reina have one just like that?" Track looked back at me. "Yes, she does." "Is it a wolf thing?" Nicole asked, trying to get a better look at it. "No, it's a safety thing," he smiled. Alyssa looked up at Michael and her eyes narrowed. "Michael is here with you. This wolf is jet black, just like Reina's hair. And that necklace..." Her eyes widened and she looked down at me again, this time with a grin I did not like. Great. What now? I thought, and Track turned to Michael. Then he noticed that Martin wasn't with him. "Martin's back at Reina's room," Track stated. I noticed he was careful not to flat out lie, although I wondered why. Alyssa eyed Michael, who stood staring back at her quietly. Just then a door down the hallway opened, and Jonathan and Aunt Mary stepped out. They must have heard us, or Jonathan heard me. A wave of relief washed over me as Jonathan shot me a quick smile as I walked towards us. It took everything I had to stay standing where I was. I watched him approach and focus on his face. He seemed a bit excited, but also worn out. I looked to Aunt Mary, and she smiled down at me. "Well, hello there," she stated, and I was glad that she did not kneel down and hug me. I quickly told Jonathan what Elsa had noticed and what she thought because of that. He looked at Track, who could also hear me, and then smiled at him. "I see you brought your friend." Track nodded and Jonathan knelt. Margaret and Nicole quickly following, as if they thought he was going to teach them the proper way to talk to a werewolf. "It's good to see you again," he smiled, and I gave a soft bark. That just tickled Margaret to giggles. "I hope that necklace works as well for you as it does for Reina," he continued, and I smiled and sighed. Alyssa eyed Track. "Why didn't you tell us you have a girlfriend? Mate." Track shrugged. "Did you ever ask?" Nicole smiled at him. "She's very beautiful." Alyssa wasn't ready to believe so easily, though. "So, where are you going? And with Reina's bodyguard?" Jonathan stood up and turned to her with a look that made her flinch a little, but it was Aunt Mary that replied. "Is it your practice to question your cousin's friends?" she snapped, then smiled at Track. "This boy here has full run of this manor. His actions are never questioned, I should say." Man, I liked Aunt Mary. She turned to Jonathan then. "Now, sweetheart, you run along. I'm sure Reina will be waking soon." Jonathan looked at his watch. "She normally isn't up for another hour yet." He turned to Track. "Mind if I join you? We're going to see the scientists about the necklaces, right?" Track nodded, and Aunt Mary turned to the girls. "So now, do you all have your outfits ready for the party?" That got Margaret and Nicole chatting away quickly, and Jonathan's aunt nodded. "Just remember, anyone who tries to outdo the female will look badly." "Oh no, my dress is very pretty, but I was careful not to overdo it," Nicole put in quickly. Track turned and started down the hallway. I followed, with Jonathan walking next to him, and Michael behind us. "Outdo me?" I asked, and they glanced down at me. When we were on the first floor, Jonathan whispered, "It's considered very rude to try to outdress the female at a couple's party." "Why? Who cares what they wear?" "Because you're supposed to be the center of attention," he grinned. I snorted. "That sounds like a human wedding that I saw in the movies. This is just a coupling party. Really, all this—" But I stopped my thoughts when Jonathan's smile fell. "Okay, so maybe I really didn't understand how important this was. I mean, I knew what it symbolized, and was our commitment to each other. It told all the people in our worlds that we were spoken for. It opened us up to be able to do things together that were normally frowned on. But if it was this extreme, how was it any different than a union or a marriage?" Jonathan stopped and knelt down. "This party is us telling everyone in our worlds that our life is no longer just our own." Okay, that was deep, but still, all of this? He stood when my dad and his dad approached. They both smiled down at me, and my dad knelt down while Jonathan's talked to him. "Good evening, sweetheart," he smiled, and I barked softly. "Tomorrow's the big night," he stated, looking at me with his sparkling eyes. "You and I will have a talk later." My eyes widened. What talk was this? Seriously, with as nuts as they were all being about this, what would be left for the union? It would seem dull and boring, at least as far as all the priest stuff went. I stepped up to him and rubbed my cheek against his chest. He chuckled and gave me a soft hug. Then 3 alarms went off. One from Jonathan, one from Track, and the other from Michael. I jumped a bit, but my dad just laughed and stood. The 3 pushed buttons on their watches, and Track looked down at me. "Hungry?" I barked twice that time. Jonathan looked at Track, and Mr. Hilver nodded. "I have to have a talk with my son. He'll be along soon." I saw Jonathan's eyes lower, and he looked at me. I reached my nose over and pushed it against his hand. "It's okay. I understand," I thought. He gave me a sad smile, and I turned and followed Track. After all, he was the one with the thumbs, and my stomach was suddenly growling on its own. The cook sat a large bowl of delicious stew in front of me. Track got one too, with a spoon. I licked my bowl clean and was done before he was. One of the benefits of being in wolf form. I lapped up my water when he finished. I could sense him watching me, but when I looked up, he was busy over his bowl. I sat and waited while he finished. "You eat slow," I thought, and he grinned into his bowl. When he was finally done, I moved towards the back door. I remembered the smells and the feeling of being out there. I had been cooped up so long. It was worse for my wolf. In this form, I craved it like food. I needed to run, to feel the ground under my paws and the wind through my fur. I sniffed at the door, wondering if some of the scents would lead in. but this place was locked up too tight. It was still too early for the moon, so the shields were drawn. A small whimper came out, and I scratched at the door. I heard the cook and Track talking quietly behind me, but I didn't care. I wanted out there. I needed to be out there. Then I pushed up, putting my front paw on the door and sniffing at the handle. It was round, and I could smell all the people that had touched it recently. When I nudged it with my nose, Track walked over. "You can't, Ray. It's still light outside." I pushed back and sat on the tile floor. Wolf cravings or not, that was something I couldn't argue with. The sun would kill me. Survival overrode desire, and I turned and looked up at him. "Someday I want to run outside," I let my thoughts tell him. "I know," was all he said. "I've never run out there as a wolf." He nodded again, this time looking sad. "Come on," Track whispered as he turned around, and we both left the kitchen and the door that held me inside. Going to stop there.